We're in a series of sermons called Closer, and I want you to understand how that came about. Actually, I had prepared to preach something else through January, and going into November, I just felt like the Spirit was tapping me on the shoulder, saying, "You know what, Ron, you drifted away a little bit this last year. I wasn't in any danger of losing my faith. There had been a drifting, and it wasn't toward God; it had been away from God. And if you're in a spiritual journey with Him, you've probably been there at some point too. But the tapping was, maybe this next year you ought to commit to getting closer again. And that's how this whole series came together. Because I know that deep inside, I yearn to have a closeness with God. King David talked about that a lot. My soul pants for you like a deer that's panting for water, like a thirsty deer pants for water. My soul is constantly panting for you. And I was experiencing that, and yet I wasn't getting the thirst quenching that I wanted. And so I committed this whole year, 2019, to just having a closer walk. And I knew exactly what had to happen. And so we put this series together because I thought, you know what, I need to preach to myself first and then bring you with me. And I can tell that some of you who are on this journey with me, you're already beginning to experience a closer walk. And that's exactly what we wanted. This is my invitation for you to come with me on this, all right? This isn't to make anyone feel guilty. I don't want anyone to walk out of here feeling bad. That's not my purpose. I'm asking you to go with me on this. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Bible reading, and we got a whole bunch of people reading their Bibles. We're going to read through the New Testament this year. It's a chapter each morning for 5 days, Monday through Friday, and then you get the weekend off. But we have people reading. And then I said, would you just take some selfies of yourself reading in different places? And they're starting to come in, and I love this. You'd have no idea how God is encouraging me through this. Cody, he's there in his work truck, and he likes to read his Bible on his first break and reads it off his phone. And Lisa sent in she's up in Chicago. I said, especially if you travel somewhere, take a selfie. And so she stepped out on the street, and she wanted me to know it was Chicago. See the Trump building in the back? Which I'm like, that's a good place to be reading your Bible right there. And then the feet picture is Suzanne's. And this is her quiet moment. And when she wrote to me and she told me about her quiet moment in the morning, she has a quiet place. Only the dog goes in there. There's no kids in there and stuff. And that's where she spends her moment. And you can see the reflection of the dog in the mirror. But just, there is a mom with her Bible open in her lap and the dog at her feet. And I just love that. And so maybe you would do that. Maybe you just take a selfie somewhere, especially if you're traveling. So I got this guy from California who's been writing me, and he's been saying, hey, I want to get on this Bible reading plan that I've heard about. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And I'm like, this is some dude from California. And then I found out it's one of our guys who's actually out there working. Okay, I got you. But it doesn't matter. He said, take a picture, send it to me of the reading plan, because I don't want to fall behind while I'm out here working. And so I just love that. And I'm like, while you're out there, you got to send back a great selfie. I want to see something from California out there sent back. And so looking forward to that. But that was the first week. Then last week we talked about prayer and talking with God, and spending a little bit more time in the prayer time would allow me to come closer. And I knew that was happening, and some of you are on that plan too. Today, I want to come into this service with the communion time. There's something about the communion time that when I'm not careful about that time, I'm not engaged. My heart isn't engaged. My mind isn't engaged. I'm just going through the motions, and I know that. The communion time is an invitation to come very, very close to a memorial. Now, tomorrow will be MLK Day, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we pause in this nation to recognize what an amazing leader he was, how he was a leader for our nation's time, how we needed to have those issues addressed. And there are monuments to him all over the world. First of all, every major city in the United States has an MLK Boulevard. All right? But that doesn't even come close. All over the world, there are statues and memorials to Martin Luther King. There's one in Havana, one in Australia, Kenya, Jerusalem, England. Even Westminster Abbey has a statue of MLK outside the west entrance, which is just amazing. But out of all of the memorials, none are probably more captivating and filled with more symbolism than the one right in our own nation. This is his monument in Washington, D.C., and it is filled with symbolism that represents his life, but it's also filled with spiritual symbolism. This idea, the person who came up with this idea for this memorial, drew it from a sentence in Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream." And one of the sentences in that "I Have a Dream" speech is that out of the mountain of despair would come a stone of hope. Now, look at that. If that front stone was pushed back into that mountain, it would fit perfectly. And when you go to visit this memorial, you literally you enter through by walking through the mountain of despair first, and then you come up to the stone of hope. And as you come around the front of the stone of hope, his image is emerging from that stone. Jesus said, "I am the stone." And out of the mountain of despair that mankind would cause by our sinfulness, Jesus comes out as a stone. And then you and I are invited to throw ourselves on that stone and become a part of that stone. And so there's rich spiritualism to this. Symbolism is everywhere. All right? This memorial, it's 30 feet tall. This memorial you can walk right up and touch. There's another MLK memorial that you cannot touch. It's his tomb. It's in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been there. It was equally as moving. It's surrounded by water. There's fences all around the water. You are not invited to come up and touch that memorial. And then it brings us to the memorial that Jesus established for himself. "This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And there's no barriers at the table of Jesus. There's nothing to hinder you from coming up and being a part and touching communion time and having that time with Jesus. But what I found myself doing last year is going through the motions and not having the experience I wanted from it. I felt like John chapter 12, where some Greeks come to the disciples and they tell the disciples, "We would like to see Jesus," they said. We just want to see Jesus. We've heard about him. We've heard about all these crazy and miraculous things he's doing. We've heard about it. We just want to see Jesus. And I found myself sometimes sitting up front here, going through communion, and my heart was just crying out, "I just want to see him." And I could not find him. I couldn't focus on him, because Satan was constantly distracting me about my day, distracting me with my ideas, with my wants and desires. He was just coming in and distracting me to where I could not lock my focus in. And I think part of that is what led to some of my drifting away. And so trying to come back, trying to come closer, I think that this moment here in the communion service that surrounds communion is the center point of our worship. It's not the sermon. This is after that. It's not the singing. Communion time is that centerpiece where we stop everything we're doing in our world and say, "I'm going to focus on Jesus for a moment." And what do I want to remember? I want to remember his life, and I want to remember his death. Now, let me give you a little background, because just as the MLK Memorial is full of symbolism, communion time and the communion table is full of symbolism. Let's just go through it real quick, all right? First of all, there's letter A. There's the bread and the body factor. Jesus said, he took, Luke tells us, Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, all right, that breaking of the bread. He gave it to his disciples saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Jesus is the bread. Now, here's why that's important, because it has strong Old Testament connections as well. In the Old Testament, when God told Moses, "You go get my people out of Egypt. I'm going to free them from slavery," all right? I'm going to free them from bondage. Everything MLK was excited about, everything Martin Luther King wanted to bring to our world. He said it's an unfinished work yet, is to release our people from complete bondage. That's what God was doing in the Old Testament with Israel. And so he sends Moses into Egypt. He brings them out of Egypt. And when they're out of Egypt and they're in the wilderness, they're getting hungry. And God feeds his people. Catch this. Some of you have never heard this. He feeds his people by letting bread rain down from heaven. It's manna in the wilderness is what it was called. And every morning they could go up and they could pick up as much bread as they want. Bonnie makes bread at our house, and I'm telling you, everyone in our house stops. The smell of bread is overwhelming. And if she turns her back on me, I'm going to grab a biscuit and I'm going to dip it into gravy before anybody else eats. That's what I'm going to do. I just love bread. And when you know it, you get on a diet, you got to cut those carbs out. I love carbs. You got to cut those sugars out, but I love sugars. You got to cut out gluten. Gluten is awesome. No more. Not at the table. When you come to the table of Jesus Christ, you're invited to come and take of the bread because he is the bread. Now, God brought manna down from heaven in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, in the new covenant that you and I are under with Jesus, he becomes the bread that comes down from heaven. Do you see the symbolism here? It's found in John chapter 6. These are Jesus' words. Our forefathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, it was not Moses. Moses isn't the one who gave you the bread from heaven, but it was the Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God, now catch this, the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Now he's that bread. Sir, they said, from now on, give us this bread. Yeah, I bet. Jesus declared, I am the bread. I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never go thirsty. When you and I are eating this bread, Jesus connected it to his body. He said, this is me. And so when I'm eating that little wafer, that little piece of bread, this is a moment to remember him. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Letter B, then you have the juice and the blood factor. In the same way, after supper, Jesus took the cup, saying, this cup now is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. My blood will be poured out for you. We just got done singing a lot about blood. If you're a newcomer here, this might have freaked you out. If you've been in church a long time, you can probably explain it. But when you're a newcomer and you come into the Christian church and we're singing about blood and we're talking about blood and we're preaching about blood, and then we pretend we're drinking blood, we sound like a bunch of vampires to them. They're like, what is this blood fixation that this church has? It all comes back to this moment where Jesus said his blood, we would be partakers of that blood. We would drink that blood. It would become a part of who we are. And why is blood such an important part? Because God said sin requires a blood sacrifice. In Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. John writes, the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from sin. And so blood is very, very important in the communion time, and we drink his blood. It's symbolism, I know, but it is rich symbolism. But probably the piece that was missing for me is letter C, the Passover and communion factor of this whole thing. All right, some more background. In John 13, Jesus takes his disciples up to an upper room because he's going to celebrate the Passover with them. But this is where he initiates communion. Now, what was Passover? Way back in the Old Testament again, when God was having his people freed from bondage, freed from slavery, freed from Egypt, he could not break Pharaoh's back. Every time he sent a plague to break Pharaoh's back, Pharaoh wouldn't give in and he wouldn't let the people go. And finally he brought the big one. The 10th plague was a death angel that came down on Egypt and claimed the life of every firstborn child. Every firstborn. Now think about this. Maybe you're a firstborn. Or maybe you have a child that's a firstborn. And the death angel is coming for them. And God said, all you have to do to have the angel pass over your house and not bring death to your house is put blood on your doorstep, on your door threshold. And so they literally killed and took the blood, and the blood of a lamb, and they put it on the doorpost. And then that night, when the death angel came into Egypt, every house that he found that had that blood on the doorpost, he passed over that house. Egypt was hit hard that night. Painful, painful night for Egypt. And it finally broke the back of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, go, just get out of here. And that's finally what brought the freedom to the Israelites. At that moment on, God initiated a ceremony, the Passover, every year. Jews would travel forever to get to Jerusalem to participate in Passover. For years and years and years, every Jew dreamed of just having Passover in Jerusalem. And so at this time in Jerusalem, this is Passover time. Thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of lambs are being sacrificed for the sins of God's people. At the same time they're sacrificing lambs, that's when Jesus will die. Jesus will become the lamb that is sacrificed for all of us so that we have Passover of the death angel. Are you following how much symbolism there is inside of this? Jesus becomes our Passover lamb. In John chapter 1, verse 29, the next day John saw Jesus coming toward him, and he said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Paul writes, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. The Old Testament prophets talked about it. He was led like a lamb to slaughter. Jesus will die at the same time these lambs are dying in Jerusalem for the people's sin. And once Jesus dies for our sins, there's no longer any need for a lamb sacrifice anymore. It goes away. But there's even something deeper in the Passover time. The upper room was a meal, and the Passover meal was shared with very, very close family and friends. In ancient Bible times, to eat a meal with someone was to connect to them, was to not only have just deep fellowship, but it was to be connected to them. That's why Jesus is constantly criticized for having meals with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes. If you have a meal with them, you're connected with them. And Jesus says, yeah, that's why I came. And some of us go through communion and we hesitate. We think, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to come to this. And you're not worthy. And yet Jesus invites you to come to this table. It's such a powerful moment where he opens the door and he tells us, if you'll just open the door. This is from Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and I knock. And if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person. That's the significance of that. Eat with that person and they'll eat with me. You will become family if you just open up that door. Think about the table, the table in the upper room. Who's at that table? I mean, who is Jesus considering part of his family? Oh, Judas is still there. When Jesus initiates communion and breaks the bread and passes out the cup, Judas is still there. And Judas will go on to betray Jesus. But at this moment, Jesus is still telling Judas, I want you to be a part of my family. I want you. He'll go on to do vile things. But at this moment, even though Jesus knows he's going to be betrayed by him, he says, I still want you in my family. Peter is there at this table. Peter will go on to deny Jesus 3 times. And in this moment, Jesus says, I still want you in my family. Thomas will be there, and Thomas will go on to reject the idea of the resurrection and doubt that Jesus was resurrected. I'm not believing until I touch his wounds, and then Jesus appears. But at this moment, he's still part of the family. I don't care what you have done in your past. I don't care how dark your sin is or how big the mistake is. I know that I feel the same way about mine. My sin is too much. God, there's no way. And Jesus says, yes, there is a way. Come to the table. Come and have a meal with me. And the critics outside, oh my goodness, I can't believe that Jesus is eating with Ron. Yeah, but he does, and he eats with you too. And part of what's going on at communion time, you cannot have communion without having the community of the family. You're surrounded at communion time by family members. They believe what you believe. They have the same heart that you have. And your family during communion. It's very, very powerful when you focus on it. All of this, the body, the cup, the blood, the community aspect is all part of getting re-amazed with what Jesus did on the cross. So I was in youth ministry. This is back before I entered into preaching ministry. I was in youth ministry. And I took a group of people down to Florida for Bible Bowl. And when we got down there, we discovered that one of the members of our team had never seen the ocean. He'd never seen the ocean. And he said, please tell me we're going to see the ocean. I said, we're going to see the ocean. And when we pulled up there in front of the ocean, it was actually, you couldn't see the ocean just yet because there were all these mounds of sand and these sand dunes. And I said, you know what? I said, the ocean is just over those sand dunes. And he jumped out. Tommy just took off running. And so we were so excited for him. I said, come on, let's go. And we all jumped out of the van, and we're just running behind him. And he got to the last dune. He topped it, and there was a whole ocean. And he just stood there, and he just started saying the same word over and over again. Wow. He's like, wow. He could even say it backwards. Wow. And at first, I thought he had come up over the dune, and then there was one of those all natural, Florida sunbather kind of things going on. And I ran up there real quick to cover, and I'm looking, and it was close. And I'm like, what is going on? I said, Tommy, are you okay? He just, wow. And then he ran down to the waterfront, and he just fell in the sand, water splashing up over his knees, and just kept saying it. Wow. I said, Tommy, what is going on? It's so big. Did you think the ocean was smaller? I mean, I'm just, I'm trying to catch up with him, and it's so amazing. And it took all of us a while to recapture that wow factor. I had forgotten to stand at the ocean and just go, wow. And because of Tommy, I recaptured that. And after a while, we all just found ourselves sitting there in a just total amazement of the ocean. Somewhere in communion that had slipped away from me too last year, and I don't want to do that. When I come to communion, I want to have that wow factor. Wow, Jesus, I cannot believe what you did. That you would die for me, a sinner. That you'd put your body under that much torture, that the blood would flow that rich. And for me. And that's what communion is all about.